This week on Who Deserves to Be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, we make the case for putting Peter, Paul, and Mary into next year's class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and we briefly explain why they might not get in. This week, we're going to look at the case for putting New York City's Peter Yarrow, Paul Stookey, and Mary Travers, better known these days as Peter, Paul, and Mary, into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Honestly, I'm kind of shocked that I have to look at the case because I could have sworn that they were already in, since they've been eligible since the very first class of the Hall back in the mid-1980s. It's also doubly shocking when you consider how many artists from the early 1960s are in by now. So, with all that said, let's try to figure out why they're not in, although I think that the Motley Crue clause, as I call it, may be one of the big reasons. First, though, as always, we will start with the stats. So, to the tail of the tape we go. Peter, Paul, and Mary released 7 studio albums, 8 live albums, 13 compilation albums, and 13 EPs. Plus, they released 2 children's albums. Of those, 11 hit the top 40 in America, including 5 of those 11 hitting the top 10. 1964's live album, Peter, Paul, and Mary in Concert, went to number 4, along with their first 4 studio albums. Their 1962 self-titled debut album went to number 1. Their 1963 album, Moving, hit number 2. And their album, In the Wind, which was released later that year, went to number 1. Their 4th released studio album, 1965's A Song Will Rise, went to number 8. In the UK, 3 of their albums and 4 of their EPs all went top 40. Of those, the highest any of their studio albums got was number 18. And that was 1969's Peter, Paul, and Mommy. 2 of their EPs went top 10, which were their 1963 self-titled 2 EP releases. Volume 1 went to number 3. Volume 2 went to number 5. Their 1962 self-titled debut album and their 1970 compilation album, The Best of Peter, Paul, and Mary, 10 Years Together, both went double platinum. Their 1967 album 1700 as they called it, went platinum, and 4 of their studio albums, 1 live album, 1 children's album, and 1 compilation album all went gold. As far as the charts say, none of them went gold or platinum in the UK. As far as their singles went, they released 29 of those. Of those, 18 hit the top 40 on the various American charts, including 10 of those 18 that hit the top 10, with 1963's Puff the Magic Dragon and Blowing in the Wind, along with 1969's Leavin' on a Jet Plane, all hitting number 1. In the UK, only 3 of their songs hit the top 40, with Leavin' on a Jet Plane being their only song to get to the top 10, landing at the number 2 slot. That is a relatively solid grade A commercial success resume right there. So let's look at their influence then. The group was at the forefront of the massive folk rock movement in the early 1960s, just before the Beatles started to rule things in 1964. Peter, Paul, and Mary influenced later artists like James Taylor, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Carole King. Bob Dylan said that Peter, Paul, and Mary were partially responsible for making him popular in the early 1960s because of the way that they took a few of his songs, like Blowin' in the Wind, and gave them harmonies that landed the songs on the pop singles charts. Also, their social activism in their lyrics and outside of music helped to inspire other artists to take stands on issues. Again, another grade A. So, what's keeping them out of the Hall? Well, for starters, some people think that folk music has no place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is kind of weird. Whatever. Still, others say that they only helped to make folk music popular, but really didn't do anything to influence the genre. I think that there might be a deeper reason why they might not get any consideration, and it all has to do with what I call the Motley Crue clause. I'll explain. Some years back, the guys in Motley Crue said in an interview that they were told that they would never be let into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame due to their past behavior. What behavior, you ask? Well, check out their book, The Dirt, if you really want to know, or the miniseries that came out. I think it's still on Netflix. There is way too much bad behavior to mention here. I guess the Hall is now holding bad behavior against artists, which in my opinion is kind of stupid, considering how much bad behavior other artists who were already in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame did. By the way, Motley Crue should have been in the Hall about a decade ago, but I digress. So, what bad behavior did Peter, Paul, and Mary do? Well, Peter Yarrow was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison back in the early 1970s for, well, to put it delicately, having something to do with someone under the age of 15. There you go. He was pardoned by President Jimmy Carter back in early 1981, the day before Carter left office, which was kind of controversial in its own right. However, people have not forgotten about what he did, so that may be one of the main reasons why the group has never really been considered. I don't know. I may be wrong on that. It does, however, seem like a logical reason as to why they're in yet. If so, that's really not a reason to keep them out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. At least not to me. Because of their music and because they did influence a lot of artists back in the early 1960s, and they made folk music very popular along with Bob Dylan and also Joan Baez. Can't forget Joan Baez. Peter, Paul, and Mary should take their rightful place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that is it for who deserves to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We also invite you to check out our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast, where we go over what happened on that date in music history. That podcast drops daily, including weekends, on this channel that you're either watching or listening to this podcast on. We also have the Music History In-Depth podcast, where we go more in-depth into the events that happened for that week in music history. And that podcast posts every Tuesday on this channel that you're either watching or listening to this podcast on. Thank you very, very much for listening or watching if you're on YouTube or Spotify.